Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. This evening, we join the NYU community as we continue to join forces to lead on efforts that tackle some of the greatest challenges of our time: inequity, social justice, environmental conservation, and to elevate the voices and experiences of so many of our Black and Brown scholars and people at the front line of conservation work globally. To do so, NYU has continued to create spaces and platforms to teach and to have dialogue around issues of inequity at all levels, at the level of the individual, at the level of the institution, structural, and beyond. This evening, our event is co-sponsored by the NYU Office of Global Inclusion, the NYU Office of Sustainability, the Department of Environmental Studies and NYU Animal Studies, the Liberal Studies Science faculty, and the members of the Sustainability, Health, and the Environment Concentration, SHE, and special thanks to our Dean, Julie Mostov, and the Liberal Studies Dean staff for their incredible support in putting all of this together. Please feel free to use the chat to ask your questions and debate, share your experiences. And I'm going to do my best to corral some of that and bring it back to our panelists for further debate and introspection as much as our time permits this evening. I am thrilled to introduce our three panelists this evening. We're going to be sharing a link to their bios in the chat. And what I'll actually be doing is giving a rather abbreviated version of their bios for us to save some time. Our first panelist is Audrey Peterman, a national award-winning conservationist and leader that has been working in the sphere of national parks, public lands, and nature conservation for upwards of 30 years. Ms. Peterman is a co-founder of the Diverse Environmental Leaders Speakers Bureau and is a prolific writer. Ms. Peterman's new book, From My Jamaican Gully to the World, tells a story of her childhood carefree journey from Jamaica that sets the stage for her life as an advocate for nature. She's an author of the travel guide, Our True Nature, Finding a Zest for Life and National Parks, and co-author with her dear husband, the book, Legacy of On the Land, a Black couple's discovery of our national heritage and why everyone should care. Her achievements have been recognized by numerous awards, including an Environmental Heroes Award presented to her by Vice President Al Gore. She has also been a central part of a coalition that led, I believe, in 2017 to President Obama issuing a presidential memorandum promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in national parks and public lands. Welcome, Audrey. Our second panelist today is Professor Kiki Jennings, as I love to call her, Kiki. Professor Jennings is a professor of marine sustainability and an associate professor at the Arizona State University. She received her Ph.D. in pioneering work in the new field studying innovation and adoption of marine conservation technologies. Her research centers on human dimensions of marine sustainability, including fisheries conservation technology and marine renewable energies. Among her numerous awards she has received is the Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship on Ocean Science, and she's also an esteemed member of the National Academy of Science and Ocean Studies. Welcome, Kiki, and thank you so much for joining us. Finally, our third panelist this evening is Kelvin, Alie, Senior Vice President of Field Partnerships for the Global Field Programs for Conservation International. Kelvin has over 20 years of experience in working in international conservation and natural resources management. Prior to joining CI, he worked for the International Fund for Animal Welfare, where he held several key positions around the world, most recently as Executive Vice President for Strategy, Programs, and Field Operations. He's a native of the island of Dominica, not the Dominican Republic, by the way, the Commonwealth of Dominica. Kelvin holds several degrees, including degrees in forestry and biodiversity from the United Kingdom, and also a degree in economics from here in New York at the City University of New York. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. And I pay special homage to our panel today because in many ways, I'm pulling on their own personal experiences, some of which are a pleasure, but some I recognize are stressful experiences. Today, to get into what we're talking about, I begin with a reflection on my own experiences as an NYU faculty member, professor, and teacher. And I begin by reflecting on just before lockdown in the fall of 2019, when I took what would be my last field trips before COVID struck us all down into the northern woods of Central Park. Here you can see the class standing with a member of, or a leader from the New York City Audubon. And what happened at this point is something which would radically influence how I led my field trips that semester and henceforth. What happened was that there was one student, an African-American young lady, and she stepped away from the group just as we started to go on our birding trip. And she asked me a question. She asked me, did you watch When They See Us? I remember studying the faces of the students in the group, and I could tell some of them had no idea what was When They See Us. But in fact, what she was referring to was Ava DuVernay's Emmy-nominated Netflix series about 5 young Black boys who were falsely accused of beating, raping, and leaving for dead a white woman in Central Park in 1989. And the series follows their ultimate exoneration in 2002 and the settlement reached with the New York City in 2014. The boys were 14-year-old Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, 14, Antron McCrae, 15, Yusuf Salam, 15, and 16-year-old Corey Wise. At the time, Donald Trump, then New York City property mogul, convinced that the teens were guilty, spent a reported $85,000 US on 4 full-page ads in New York City newspapers, calling for the death penalty to be brought back and for the boys to be executed. He wrote in the newspapers, and I quote, "I hate these murderers, and I always will. I am not looking to understand them. I am looking to punish them." I remember this young lady in my class, studying my face or response, and I paused. I want to introduce another story which overlaps with the one which I'm telling you about teaching and birding in Central Park. So in this picture, here I am, fresh to the United States, and I got an opportunity to go to Yellowstone and to the Grand Canyon. I was so excited. And in this picture, I'm actually looking at the Druids, one of the most famous wolf packs around the world, some people say. And I was seeing wolves in the wild for the first time. And I was having this experience that sociologists and psychologists describe as we-ness, this sense of being a part of the global community of conservationists. And I felt so like, oh my God, look at me, this little guy from Jamaica who was having this very amazing, global, wonderful experience, bird watching, seeing here at the Grand Canyon, where I went on to witness other iconic wildlife. It was amazing. What would happen next though, within, I would say, about 30 minutes of this picture being taken is actually what I want to reference. Because this very idyllic experience would reveal Blackness, and let me explain why. My spotting scope that you see me holding on to got stolen. So in a few minutes that it took me to take out my camera and remove my spotting scope and mount it onto the tripod you see me holding, somebody stole the spotting scope. You know, I was surrounded by about 30 to 40 people. You know, I was the only person of color that really had seen in several days, but I mean, it didn't really matter anything to me. However, it was not the loss and theft of the spotting scope that would linger with me. It was how my fellow birders and wolf watchers would respond. How they responded only made sense. I remember thinking if I was 3, I remember them asking, "What are you doing here? Are you sure you had a spotting scope? You know, where did you get it and how did you get here?" So these were the questions that I remember thinking about as I flew back to my campus in New York City. And I spoke with some students in my dorm. They were all students from Asia, Chinese students. And I reflected on this experience that I had about in the Grand Canyon and the loss of my spotting scope. What I received in terms of advice from these Asian students was very, very important to me, because what they said to me was, "You shouldn't speak about this, Leo." And they also said, "Ignore it." It was well-meaning advice, I must say. And what these Chinese students were describing to me was advice that they had received in terms of the potential consequences of speaking out about issues of marginalization, discrimination, xenophobia, white supremacy in American society. And that silence was the prudent approach and even necessary to maintain favor. So let's get back to my students in Central Park, and the student who is still studying my face, asking me, like, "Did you watch When They See Us?" And I responded, "Yes, I watched the first episode, but I decided not to watch anymore." And she responded to me, "I didn't watch it at all. I couldn't watch it." I had no idea that just at this spot where we were, just a stone throw away, it just would have been a few brief months that one Amy Cooper would falsely accuse a Black gay birder of threatening and assaulting her in Central Park. So again, the spot and the experiences were telling. And I'm using these experiences to direct my first question to Professor Kiki Jennings. And my question to Kiki Jennings is, should we speak about this intersection of Blackness and biodiversity, and what is there to speak of, if there is anything at all?
So thank you, Leo. Absolutely, we need to speak about it. We need to tell these stories. And the reason why is right now, when we think about Blackness and biodiversity, Black people and Black culture and biodiversity, it's a very thin shadow of the reality. And in this moment, when people are thinking about the changes we want to see in this country around racial justice and racial equity, if what they think is the issue is, oh, there's just not enough Black people, we just need to find some Black people somewhere, or these ideas that it's just that Black people haven't been exposed, you just need to find some Black children and take them to nature. These are myths that people embrace as reality, and funders are funding programs backed with millions of dollars to transform the face of biodiversity, based on this idea that we as Black people just don't know what's out there. And once we see it, we'll fall in love with it. They need to understand the depth of our story. that we are there, we've always been there, that we have been displaced from these spaces, that even when we persevere and reclaim these spaces, that it costs us so much more. The costs are something the system doesn't recognize. That they say, well, you get grants, you write papers, you write books like Audrey, are you vice presidents like Kelvin? Yes, but what else did it cost them? What did it cost with the time with their families? What did it cost to their bodies and their health? Until they understand that full story, we can address the issue of access of Black people to wild spaces. So that's why we need to tell the stories, because we need to change the narrative.
Thank you, Professor Jenkins. So, Audrey, you have written about national parks and you've been on the radio since the 1990s talking about national parks. Could you just speak to this issue for us in terms of what is the history of the relationship between Black and Brown people with national parks here in the United States? And you as an advocate, what would you tell people should be their experiences now? Why should they go to national parks?
Well, thank you so much, Professor Douglas. Thank you for the opportunity to be on with you. And thank you to my brilliant fellow panelists and to NYU. You can see I'm coming to you live and in living color from the Grand Canyon today. Well, not really, it's a backdrop. But I could in fact be coming to you from the Grand Canyon because it has all the amenities for meeting space and technology, etc. A thing that many people of color don't yet know or just beginning to know. So for the last 25 years, not 30, I've been actively involved with promoting the national parks, particularly to Americans of color, and promoting our history within them. Because as Americans, as the first Americans were offloaded off the ships in 1492, in August 25th, 1492. Wait, yes, August 25th, 1619 rather, I'm so sorry about that. We were offloaded off the ships, and that place where we stepped onto the shores of North America is actually part of the national park system. So throughout my travels of 185 units of the park system from the US Virgin Islands to Alaska, we have uncovered the places where Americans of color, Black people, Native people, Asians, and people of Hispanic descent have all made irretrievable and invaluable contributions to the development of our country. America could not be what she is today unless if it were not for the contributions of the people that are protected in some of these national parks and historic sites. And I can tell you that when Frank and I first, quote unquote, discovered the national parks, quite by accident, driving around the country from coast to coast, from Florida to Washington State and back, and places in between, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Sequoia, we were horrified to find that there was less than a handful of Black and brown people among the hundreds of thousands of people who were out there enjoying these stupendous natural vistas, which, by the way, we all pay taxes for to support, right? And then as I became more engaged with advocacy and more engaged with providing information and an invitation to people to come out and see what belongs to us, I found that there were entities that were very interested and committed to suppressing the amount of information that got into communities of color, and were not at all interested in engaging us and having us come out there. In fact, there's a story in the National Parks magazine of, I think it was an issue in 1994, where some writers, letter writers to the editor, were responding to a story in an earlier issue that talked about the challenge that the Park Service was having in engaging, racial minorities. I was like, what challenge? Because I don't have a challenge, and the people responded saying, we come out here to get away from the problems caused by racial minorities. We don't want them out here. Do not bring them out here to despoil our oases. But I'm here to say, as a naturalized American who pays taxes, and who believes that I'm a citizen of the world. I have a right and responsibility to be wherever I want to be and to be engaged in whatever lawful pursuit I want to be. Nobody can stop me from visiting the national parks or doing anything I want to do. And I think that this is a very opportune moment with the Biden-Harris administration, where things are on the verge of a big change, and the change is in our hands in this moment.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you again for your work over the years, which I'm still just like so thrilled when I hear all about it. I turn now to Kelvin. Kelvin, you have worked internationally on so many continents on these issues, and you've also written about these intersections between people, biodiversity, protected areas, natural resources. Is what Audrey has described, what I described, what Kiki described, are these American experiences only? Or are there parallels? Are there cases? Is this present outside the United States? Kelvin, you're still muted.
Sorry about that. Good evening, Leo. Thank you for having me join this esteemed panel this evening. It's really great to be among the greats, Kiki, Jenkins, and Audrey, and yourself. It's really critical, obviously, with our interests on this topic, something that we really care about. I want to thank NYU as well for really hosting this platform, and also to our amazing audience, right, that's listening right now. I mean, Leo, to answer your question, I think the simple answer is no. It's not just a US phenomenon. I mean, there are a couple of facts that I wanted to really bring out tonight as we have the discussion, right? So I wouldn't be surprised to those of you on the panel, neither I think would be surprised to those listening. One, the international conservation movement, it's not diverse. That's a fact, right? It's not diverse. It's not limited to the US. Unfortunately, the history of legacy of colonialism and racism in the global conservation and environmental movement has not been kind to Black and Indigenous people and people of color. Let's just put that out there, right? The idea, and Kiki mentioned some of it, the issue of displacements, the forced eviction of Indigenous people and local communities from their land. So let's just be honest about that. The societies that are disproportionately impacted by environmental destruction, right? It's predominantly the people of color, communities of color, Indigenous people and local communities, those on the front lines. Majority of the biodiversity is held in the global South. Let's just be frank about that. And the other thing I wanted to say, Leo, is the level of activism that has been happening in the US over the last year or so, and even before that, the Black Lives Matter movement has really elevated the issue and has actually created a sense of urgency, not just for those in the environmental movement, but we see it across the US, an urgency that creates that platform and that voice and the need for representation of people of color in the movement. So let's, I just wanted to put that out there as a fact. The other thing I would say is that a number of organizations, which is the good thing on the positive side, is really making an effort, really paying attention to the issue and putting in place, whether it's individual actions to address the issue, or ever investing in making sure that we have more people of color and we are reaching people where they are. We're doing the necessary outreach to make sure that we have more people involved in the conservation movement. So yes, the international conservation movement is not, it's obviously it's Black diversity, but there is a good effort in the direction to make sure that we have more diverse voices. And we see it, I see it on the international conservation stage, right? When I came into the movement 25 years ago, right? Starting from the small island of Dominica, going to graduate school, and then obviously working for an international NGO. I mean, in most of the meetings I've been in, the discussions around issues that are happening in the global South, I was, probably the only one sometimes in those meetings, right? And I look now and I see that there are 2, 3, 4 more people of me sitting around the table. So there's been some level of improvement, but I think it's important that we acknowledge the sort of the challenges that we have had in the past. And as Kiki mentioned, it's not about the perceived lack of interest. It's not about, lack of expertise. the issue of willful neglect and exclusion. It's an issue of bias. I think, and as you pointed out in your own experience, there's an issue of fear, right? Because those of us who have been in the movement, 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't be sitting around having that conversation, right? Because of fear of what potentially could happen to us in terms of our own profession. So I think we have come a long way, but it's not unique to the US. And I think the global movement we have seen last year has galvanized, and we see it in Europe, and we see all the cities across the world where there's a lot of movement to ensure that Indigenous people, local communities, Black and Indigenous people of color are involved more, and we are more engaged on the environmental issues.
Thank you, Kelvin. I want to turn back to both Kiki and Audrey, because I'm just also thrilled that we have two Black women on the panel this evening, and speak a little bit, reflect on these issues or intersection of gender and race, identity, and space. So I would argue that in society, we have seen significant strides in gender equality issues. We're not there yet by any means, but what has the experience been like being a Black woman within conservation spaces? And I mean, I'm thinking about this broadly, not only in terms of a national park, but as an academic within whatever workspaces those are, going to conferences, doing field work. Kiki, could you start us off and just tell us a little bit about that intersection?
Yes, on one level, it means that it's still creating firsts. Almost every institution I have gone to, I'm the first Black woman to get a Ph.D. in marine science from Duke University. I'm the first Black woman in University of Washington's School of the Environment, College of the Environment. Those things continue to be the first. There's the intersectionality there. There aren't any Black people. There still isn't equity with women. You bring those things together. What that means is I'm still breaking through walls. I often say that in addition to being a good scientist, I have to be a social linebacker. And what that means for us as a community, as a field, that there are brilliant scientists who are maybe not a social linebacker, who are not breaking through and becoming the first because of these barriers that exist. The other aspect of it to me is vulnerability. So in all these systems in which we are working in, science and academia, government even, are very hierarchical systems. And so in hierarchical systems where people may have longevity and need the approval of people ahead of them to move forward, abuses can happen. And we know that abuses happen for women, and we know that abuses happen for Black people. You bring them together and you are the epicenter of what would make you a target. So in every institution that I've been in, except for two, I've been sexually harassed. And part of that, I think, is because they're predators in systems. And they go, oh, she's alone. It's obvious I'm alone. There's no one else that looks like me. Who's she going to talk to? Who's she's going to go to? Who's going to have her back? And so we have those vulnerabilities. Women, Black women, they suffer in these systems. And the Black women who persevere, they do it because they find ways of overcoming that are not okay. They're coping mechanisms. And we started telling stories. I'm going to tell a story that just recently I have begun to tell in small groups. This is going to be the first time I tell this story publicly, but I tell it as an example of what we as Black women do to survive and succeed in this system. So when I was in graduate school, again, first Black woman to get a PhD, I just said my university, I wasn't planning to. There were not anyone else that looked like me. And most people were white, and many of them were male. And there were a few other people who were different, and different in that they were from Puerto Rico or they were from Taiwan or whatever. And we kind of banded together. I didn't have a lot of support there within the system. And I had a couple of friends. I had, in addition to my advisors, another faculty member who I thought was my mentor and my friend. And there was a day that I was in a car, and he, the professor, walked up to the car, and I was with my friends, and he had this very tiny t-shirt. And this was in the time of the baby tees, you know, it was like they were tiny little things, but this wasn't actually a baby tee. It was a shirt for a child. And he said to me, Kiki, I brought you this present. And I looked at it, I mean, literally it's for a child. And I just laughed. because I thought it was a joke. He's like, no, I brought this for you. You should try this on. And I was like, I can't fit into that. That's for like a 5-year-old. And then the people who I thought were my friends reached behind. I was sitting in the back of a car and they ripped my shirt off. And I was sitting there in my bra with a professor who I thought was my mentor and friend, and a couple of the few people on this campus who I thought were my friends, my advocates, in my bra. And the only thing that I had to cover myself was a shirt meant for a child. And so I took that shirt meant for a child and I put it on, and it was a struggle to cover myself. And in that moment of needing to survive in the system, I looked at everyone laughing and I thought, oh, I must be wrong. This is a joke. This isn't what it feels like to me. This is an assault on my person. It's a joke. And so I started laughing too. And I actually convinced myself that that was a joke. I never revisited. I treated those people as my friends until just 2 years ago. I was able, somehow my psyche, these ways that we protect ourselves in a system that is not friendly to us, was able to accept that that was an assault on my person. That wasn't a joke. That's not how friends treat each other. And what that showed to me was indeed just how vulnerable I was and the amount of abuses I would accept to get that PhD. And so that's the story I've begun to highlight around these intersectionalities, is also the increased vulnerability, so we can have our eye on protecting the people who need protections.
Kiki, I'm really lost for words. I mean,
Yes,
absolutely.
that really sears my heart.
Absolutely lost for words. It speaks also to something which myself, Kelvin, and others have also been thinking about. The fear that sometimes we suppress to survive, and the reluctance to actually share the real experiences that we have had publicly, and sometimes even with our best friends, to be honest. You know, I'm just going to just give a moment to Kelvin and Audrey, just to kind of also think about these issues of fear. And are we in a different moment now because we have had the year of advocacy and activism that we have had to get above and beyond that?
You know, Leo, that's a very good question. And obviously you and I have had a lot of interesting conversations about this. You know, I would say, and that's why, you know, I mentioned about the activism that has happened over the last 2 years. And I think that has given a lot of us, I think, the courage to come out and speak up on the issue. You know, when I started working in international conservation, you know, I worked for my first organization I worked for was predominantly white, right? I was the only Black person. And I was based out of Cape Cod. So you can just imagine being predominantly on Cape Cod, which is obviously not in those days. Probably it's a little bit more diverse now, but those days it was. And I think, you know, I never once, you know, really took a step back and say, well, you know, you're coming from a small island, you know, obviously getting an opportunity of your lifetime to work in international conservation. I mean, that's a big deal. I mean, I remember telling some friends of mine that, you know, you almost feel like you hit the lottery, right? You got to pinch your, you know, did I really get a job? Am I really working for an international conservation NGO? I mean, it's like you know, in those days it was a luck of the draw, right? So I think you tend to focus on your passion, what you're interested in, what you're good at, and you're working in an environment where you're really trying to do good, right? You're driven by your passion. So you don't really take a step back and really think about, well, why aren't there other people like me, you know, working for the organization, right? And I'm talking about international conservation. I'm not talking about, you know, when you get into the islands and you get into Africa and Asia, obviously you see more people like you that are working for these organizations. Granted, some of them are not in the positions of authority, but you see that, right? But you put your head down and you you do your work, you know, you do your work, you get the job done, you focus on what it is, and you don't pay attention. And you know, by and large, you know, you just roll with it. You roll with it, you know. And then you start to really think about, you know, over the years, start to think about, well, why aren't there more people like me, right, in the conservation movement, in leadership positions? And then you start to buy into that thing, as Kiki was saying. Well, we probably were not interested. And I remember, you know, friends of mine in New York, when I said I was going to work for an international conservation organization, I'm moving to Cape Cod. They say, "Are you crazy? You live in New York and you're moving to Cape Cod? Are you mad? Don't you know what, you know?" And I, you know, you get that. Then I worked on a lot of international campaigns where, you know, you go to international UN conventions and you take a step back and you look at the issues that the Western and the Northern countries are pushing, and you look at the Southern countries on one side, and then you look at it and say, whoa, is that modern day racism or colonialism? And I remember a lot of the people from the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific islands used to come up to me and say, but what are you doing working for this all-white organ? They don't care about that. They don't care about indigenous people. I mean, you know, you're just a prop to them, right? So you start to buy into that, right? But you still put your head down and you do your work. And coming from a culture of people not speaking up, I think you think that, okay, well, you know, let me just keep my mouth shut and move on. And then, as I said, you start to work more in the field, you really start to question, and you start to really, sometimes you buy into that, right? Is it a bias? Is it, but we're not seeing a lot of people like me hiking? Is it because they don't like hiking? I go out and I do a lot of bird watching. You know, I don't see people like me out there with my long lens. I do see people, I do get the stares, and I sometimes say, well, I'm not carrying a bazooka, that's just my camera. But you know, you roll with it, right? And I remember, you know, my son, you know, who joined a troop in Maryland, decided to become a scout, and there was a scout troop that was really focused on trying to get young Black boys to Eagle Scout. Because even for me, I mean, from the outside, I never really thought about scouting as being seen as an all-white thing. And I was like, well, why is there a special effort to get, you know, Black kids? And I remember we went out camping outdoors in Maryland, and the guy sat me down and gave me the history. Because I obviously I wasn't born in this country. He said, Kelvin, the reason why you don't see a lot of us in the outdoors is because that's where the lynching used to happen. The reason why you don't see us in the pools because that's where they used to drown us. And it was, I mean, I sat there and I got like an education from a scout master who's been in the system and was talking to me about the real fears about being in the outdoors because of that, you know, of what really has happened. It's not a perception, it has happened to Black people in the outdoors. And you were saying, Kelvin, part of what we're trying to do is, it's not like we're not interested. We're certainly. Yes, Kelvin, you turn on the TV and you look at all the nature shows, you don't see any person of color in, you know, really narrating those shows. And obviously we know the impact that have on people. And it was at that moment I really started to think about, oh, whoa, I'm working for an international organization. I'm Black, I'm in a position where I can make change. How can I, you know, develop the courage and the strength to make that change? And Leo and I used to have a lot of this conversation. And one of the things we together founded was the Caribbean Leadership in Conservation Fellows Program. You know, we came together and we put together, and our mission there was to try to ensure that we identify the emerging conservation leaders across the wider Caribbean, including our Spanish-speaking friends in Costa Rica and Guatemala and Honduras, to ensure that, you know, we sort of educate people around the issue, and we start to really do the outreach to bring more people of color in the fold, because not interest, the interest is there. It's just that the outreach is not happening. And I think institutions now, and I must say, and that's why I was saying early on, I think one of the things the Black Lives Movement has done and the social activism has done, it has created that level of awareness. I mean, when you see some of the institutions actually confronting their past and really addressing their legacies and making decisions, making investments in how we focused on justice, equity, and diversity and inclusion issues. That's a big deal. That wasn't there before, right? So the movement has actually really helped galvanize that. But I think, you know, for us, you know, who are fortunate to have worked in the system, and we're able to get into a position where we can actually make some change and influence some decisions. I know I'm very conscious about that. I'm extremely conscious about that. And I work for an organization that is obviously ahead of the game on those issues. I mean, my organization, Conservation International, has been at the forefront, working with indigenous peoples and local communities for eons. So I think, it's about, pushing the envelope and making sure that we ourselves are bringing other organizations involved. So I just wanted to put that out there, Leo. It's part of the consciousness now. I would say that the social activism have given us a voice, but I think the reality that there's interest out there, and we have to meet people where they are, because as I said, we are at the bottom of the stream. That's where we are the ones that are disproportionately impacted by the environmental destruction. So we have to be part of this. So there's no way we can get to a solution where we are protecting biodiversity if people of color are not meaningfully and tangibly engaged.
Yes.
On the front line.
Thank you, Kelvin. And I also want to point out, Kelvin, that even a Conservation International has evolved, because there was a time when they were criticized as well for their role and interaction with indigenous people and people across the world. Audrey, so you have written these books highlighting national parks, speaking about the intrinsic value of these areas, their values, their cultural values, etc. At this moment, how do we get beyond the fear? How do we get beyond the history and get more people of color engaged? And more specifically, I'm also thinking about what is described as the green ceiling. Last year, we saw some amazing things come out, and I just want to share my screen again briefly, coming out of the year that we just had, where we had statements from Audubon, statements from the Sierra Club. I'm just going to read some stuff that the Sierra Club put out. The Sierra Club unequivocally believes that Black Lives Matter and stands with those that protest the tragedy of George Floyd. Some incredible statistics were put forth. 70% of people in jail haven't committed a crime, and bail requirements are often make poor people choose between staying in jail to fight criminal charges or pleading guilty just to be allowed to go home. What are the next steps in terms of these institutions, which obviously have the power and have the reach in terms of, as I said, getting more Black and brown people involved at many levels?
Well, before we go into that, I would just like to say to my sister Kiki that that story really seared my heart that you had that experience. And I want to sincerely commiserate with you, because that, I don't know how I would have handled that. And to answer your previous question, Dr. Leo, I really never had any negative experiences as a woman. And I think to a large extent, that's because Frank and I come as a package together. And we chose to form our own company, our own consulting company, to provide services. So I never had a hierarchy or any bosses. And I really recommend that model to people who are going in a new career, to look at how you can start your own business to service the growing need for ecotourism, outdoor activity, heritage travel. That's especially going to explode coming out of this COVID situation. So yes, the major environmental organizations are beginning to confront their troubled past. Most recently, Sierra Club dealing with the race issues around, his name escapes me at the moment, but and more prominently, Audubon, right? The Audubon Society has come out and recognized that its most vaunted scientist, its namesake scientist, John J. Audubon, was in fact Black. And I had the opportunity to speak to a group of scientists in the Everglades recently, and I titled my presentation, the unbearable whiteness of being in the conservation world. And I pointed out that had John J. Audubon been a few shades darker, he might never have been afforded the opportunities that allowed him to bring his gifts fully to the world. So that's what we're losing with the stupid thing of race and exclusion. And, you know, it is becoming overwhelmingly obvious now that at this stage where we're facing catastrophic disaster in terms of our environment and climate issues, we don't have time for those little sophistries of exclusion. And I say little sophistries in quotes because they have such a tremendous negative impact on the lives of people of color and also on our country and planet. I think we're on a very iterative moment right now, though. I think we are on the verge of turning things around because I really feel, and from what I'm hearing from friends who are inside the Biden administration, I'm really feeling that there is a great opportunity now to really get to a more level playing field, especially since the Biden-Harris administration has committed to deploying 40% of their climate change investment toward environmental justice. And I think that engaging Americans of color and all Americans with our national parks, which, you know, and our public land system, which the national park system in particular protects the natural, cultural, and historical legacy of the country. That means the places where pivotal history was made by our ancestors are also the park system. Places like Sequoia National Park, which show how the Buffalo Soldiers were instrumental in protecting those 2,000-year-old trees, which were alive at the time when Jesus walked on earth. You know, the Harriet Tubman Memorial protects the place where, you know, she was born and grew up. The Frederick Douglass Home protects his house in Washington, D.C., where he lived for many years and worked as the great abolitionist. There are so many places all across the country. In Alaska, in Klondike Gold Rush National Park, we found the history of the Buffalo Soldiers who protected the Klondike Gold Rush in 1892. I mean, you know, they were barely a few years out of Black enslavement, and yet they were sent into this very rabid arena to protect the citizens. So I think that one way that we will be able to come out of this is to embrace the history that we can find on the public land system, and particularly in the national park system, and share this. No person can come to me and try to tell me that I am less than in America, because I can tell them where to go and find the history of where my people and where Asian people and Hispanic people and Native American, well, of course, the Native Americans were, you know, ground zero, but nobody can tell me that I am less than, because I know my worth and my value from having experienced the history and the contributions of my forebears in America in the national park system.
Thank you. Thank you, Audrey. Building on what you have said, you have given us a model to consider in terms of a small business or having your own business, or formulating ideas and approaches and engaging with public lands based on our own power and agency.
Exactly.
To Kiki, building on that, is thinking about the young people, because on this call today, we have many students who are in environmental studies programs at various levels, college levels, at the graduate level. What advice or message would you give to them as they think about their future careers based on the discussion on the topic that we're discussing today?
So I would focus on being entrepreneurial and creating community. One of the things, I'm going to actually tie together two things that Kelvin and Audrey just said. Kelvin talked about this Boy Scout troop focusing on getting Black men to Eagle Scouts. And just a month, 2 months ago, the first woman, young lady, became an Eagle Scout. And my mother, she called me, she said, Kiki, come here, I want you to see something on television. And she looked at that and she said, that would have been you. And I looked at her, and you can hear the emotion in my voice, actually. I said, yeah, that would have been me. because I fell in love with the Boy Scouts. But one, they weren't open for women when I was at that age. And there were very few scouting troops that were in the city. And so it goes to opportunity. And that opportunity, we often think about our Black and brown populations being in urban locations, and that's true, but they're also in rural locations. And when I was in North Carolina, I was in a rural location, and what I saw was a lot of young people. In fact, I'm going to go further back than high school or college. I'm going to go back to middle school, because I think that's actually a pivotal point where a lot of steps start falling into place for the things that we need for our young people to advance. The things that are going to get them scholarships, all that starts in middle school. And if you're in certain places, there are not opportunities at that level. It really is wealthy white spaces that create opportunities for middle school students. And so when I was in these rural locations, I did a program that basically said, what do you want to be when you grow up, to kids? And even though we have no internships, no engagement camps, none of these things, what can we create? And when someone said, I think that I want to be, no one said this, but a wildlife veterinarian, it's okay, we don't have that here, but we do have a cat and dog vet. Let me teach you how to get on the phone, call them up, say, I'm at this middle school. Can I come and volunteer there this summer? Can I come and shadow you? And by the end of this 2-week time period, these middle school kids learned how to write those letters, write those emails, call those people, cold call, make opportunities for themselves. And 10% of them actually followed through and did those things. Those entrepreneurial skills I learned from my mother. I am where I am because she did them for me. And then I learned to do them for myself because no one was creating those programs for me. And the next step, which is something I kind of learned along the way, at that point, we were starting to understand what does it mean to promote young Black people and people of color in these spaces where previously they had been excluded, that we need communities of support. And at the collegiate level, there are now programs that focus on that. You can find places to get scholarships. You can find clubs that are saying, let's give you a cohort. That's still not as prevalent at the graduate school level. It certainly doesn't exist once you're out in the workforce, but we still need that to persist and excel, to process the things that happen to us, to shelter each other and bolster each other up. And so we have to learn the skill of creating community where it's not created for us. And that may mean going outside the spaces. So for me, that was, I went to a church, and that was a part of my identity that would support me because it wasn't reflected where I was. That is a skill set. So those two things I think are the most important for succeeding in this career. They are soft skills and they're not tangible skills, and they're not the things that our advancement programs are talking about. Entrepreneurialness and creating your own support communities.
Thank you very much, Kiki. So I'm going to push back at all of y'all for a minute. And here is what I would like, and any of you can feel free to answer this. In terms of me as a researcher doing social science, leading research about these issues of biodiversity and national parks, spending the last 4 or 5 years interviewing 500 people, Caribbean people, Afro-Caribbean people, who will say that what we're talking about today is about privilege, that helping animals, that going outside, hiking is about issues of privilege. You know, my respondents will say, for example, that, oh, that's so great, but that sounds like, you know, you have time for vacation and, you know, like some of us gotta work. Or they'll make comments like, for example, well, I understand that there's some people who will walk a mile to save a homeless poor little puppy, but they won't walk across the road to save a Black person. How do we respond to that type of criticism as Black professionals? Because it's common, it's out there.
Well, I would say I appreciate where that person might be coming from, right? I mean, and you know, we know there's several levels of hierarchy of basic needs, right? So I would say that it really depends upon how rich and full you want your life to be. Because going to a national park does not have to involve taking off even a weekend. I mean, in some areas, for example, in Miami, the Everglades National Park, a world treasure, is right on the outskirts of, the cities of Miami, right? And Hialeah and those densely populated areas. And we developed a program to tell people of color within those communities about Everglades National Park and about how they could walk on the Ananga Trail and have the most fabulous nature experience and just a wonderful outdoor experience for themselves and their children for, the cost of a few hamburgers, really, because you can buy a yearly pass into all national parks for, I think, $80 for the entire year. It allows you and your entire carload full of people to get into every national park in the country, and many of them don't even charge entrance fees for a full year. And if you're over 62, you can get that thing for the rest of your life. And if you have a physical limitation, you can also get a big discount. So it's a matter of what you are prepared to do for yourself and your family. Should your children grow up, should another generation grow up not knowing about the national parks, not knowing about the best that our country has to offer? The national parks are considered America's crown jewels. You know what crown jewels mean? The most valued asset of an entity or a country. The most, more than 300 million people go to the national parks every year. And, more than 100 million of them come from all over the world to have these experiences that they cannot have in their home country. So why should I, as an American, comfort myself and limit myself and say why I cannot do that? I'm going to try to find ways to get it done.
I also wonder as well, but before you speak, Kelvin, if this perception of leisure and this perception of the association of parks with whiteness, so to speak, is not something that we have learned somehow, because I come from rural Jamaica, and summer you go into Mango Walk and you go into the river and you spend whole day in the river, and it was all of these things. We just called them different names. It was the hiking, it was the fishing, it was all of these things, and we never saw it in the lens that people are enunciating it now. Is it television? What is it?
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kiki.
I was going to say it's intentional. It's not television. It's not just something that we were taught. Black people were brought to these lands, was brought to the Western world to work the land. No one knew this land better than we did, because generations upon generations of our people were in that soil. And that land was taken from us. We were people of this land. Second only to the Native Americans, I would say we were people of this land, and that we worked it, and our blood, sweat, and tears were in it. The Buffalo Soldiers, the Black Cowboys, the Black fishermen, that is part of our heritage. And as this society, this country found value in the land that we were on, they dissociated us from it. They said, this is no longer yours. Your place is here. Your place is here. They removed us from it. You can look at Reconstruction. You can look at what happened after Reconstruction ended, the displacement of Black people. And because we've lost that part of our narrative, we've lost the fact that we were Maroons. The Maroons, imagine that. Black people who survived in the most difficult of ecologies, where no one else lived because it was so, we not only survived, but we thrived and we set up societies. That's how well we understood the nature. For me, growing up in Baltimore, my father, he kept hunting dogs in the backyard. I watched him skinning rabbits on the table. We fished, we crabbed. People here I'm from Baltimore City, and they have no idea that's part of who I am. And it's rich in me because both my parents would go back to the South every summer and would be there on the farms of their family, riding donkeys, fishing, all of those things. And so I would reframe it to people who say, well, that's a luxury. I would say, no, you are reclaiming your heritage. This is yours. If you want to keep something really interesting, have you seen Concrete Cowboy on Netflix, just released last week, about the Black cowboys in urban Philadelphia? And again, a process of trying to slowly dissociate those Black people from their horses and from what little bits of nature they preserved in the middle of a city to maintain that heritage. So it was systematic. And we need to let people know that this isn't a white privilege or something that's for them. This is us. It's always been ours, and we just need to reclaim it.
Kelvin, I believe you're going to
No,
respond.
I'm just going to say, well said, Kiki. I mean, I was going to almost say something similar. I mean, but in the context of the islands, and Leo, obviously, you know the same thing. I mean, it's like, I think part of it is we just have to be, aggressive and deliberate about educating our young folks. And, and that's why, I put a lot of stock in really getting out there and talking to young people, because that's what, that's the mentality that's there, and we just got to work to change it. And as Kiki well said, I mean, people don't get that history. I mean, I come from a farming and fishing community. My grandparents were farmers and fishermen, and I remember getting up in the morning and having to go change goats and change cows and go fishing and so on, and nature was always around. So I didn't have to watch, a nature show I didn't have to subscribe to Ranger Rick. Not that there's nothing wrong with that. And I didn't have to see Jack Hanna and all these, these folks on TV to be able to get, involved in the movement, right? So I would say that part of it is we really need to reclaim our history. And it's across the board. It's not just the US. When we talk about international, I mean, look at Kenya, I mean, look at South Africa, I mean, look at the history there. I mean, the history was displacement, forced eviction. I mean, I am a big fan of protected area management because I see the positive benefits to biodiversity. But I also know that fortress conservation has had, dangerous, deleterious impacts on people that were living in and around those areas. And people are coming to reclaim those areas now. And that's why, part of it is you're breaking down these sort of things that have happened in the past, but a lot of it is about educating and looking forward. So I don't see it as from where I see it as a privilege, but I will say that one of the things that in all the research you probably do, Leo, you will also see that when we talk about the lack of diversity in the biodiversity and conservation movement, and we look at the profile of the people that are in leadership in those movements, or people that are in those jobs, that the people that are working for these organizations, they do fit that sort of middle-class white privilege. So I think there's also that narrative there, which is a reality as well, right? So people, they're seeing that reality, right? And so part of what, Kiki was saying is how do we work to deconstruct some of that? And that's, for me, that's about education. That's about getting out and speaking and really building that new generation that needs to be engaged. That's why the BLM movement is so critical, because I say to people, when you look at the movement, for me, when I looked at what was taking place, and I was fascinated by the fact that it wasn't just Black young kids. I was saying to my daughter, my daughter was out there, she's an activist, and you could see, the sort of the coalition, Black, white, Asian. I mean, that's what the future is. And I think we have to find a way to reflect that in the movement as we move forward, because that's where the environmental justice work happens. And that's where we need to do the heavy lifting. So I'm optimistic about the future. I think it's important to confront the past, we look at the present, but I certainly feel hopeful about where we are going.
Yeah, there's a question from our audience, and I'm going to paraphrase it from Alie specifically. So the question is, what kind of white person within professional conservation, so somebody who is white, who is in a power of influence, already established within the conservation movement, what can they do to advance diversity, real inclusion, serious equity, belonging right now?
Me.
Go for it, Audrey.
Talk to your peers. When we got into this sector, expecting to raise awareness in communities of color, we found that the people that we really had to try harder to influence were the kind of people that you just described, who asked the question, okay? Because they would tell us ad infinitum how it's so hard to get people of color involved. It's so hard. even after we told them all the myriad ways that we would suggest that they could reach out to historically Black colleges and universities, to organizations such as Green and Youth Foundation in Atlanta, which focuses on training young people for positions in the conservation sector and in public lands field. After hours of talking to them, they would come back to that same question. How it's so hard. And I feel like either tearing my own hair out or their hair. So what they can do is talk to your peers, raise the issue of equity. Yes, because it's not for a lack of interest, and it's not for a lack of proficiency. It's not for a lack of qualifications. It's because, I'll tell you a short story. A few years ago, we were consulting for an environmental organization which said it wanted to become more inclusive, right? And they told me the story that they were looking for an accountant in New York City, and yet they wound up with a white person. So I said, excuse me, if you wind up with a white person in accounting in New York City, you're not really looking very hard. And the HR person said to me, well, the manager that we were hiring for wanted somebody that he would feel comfortable with. So of course, that was a white person, a white guy, turned out, I can tell. So I would say to this questioner, please, for God's sake, use every moment of your waking life and all of your influence to talk to your peers and tell them, stop that, because we see through it. It's not real. It's a sham. It's a shadow. And we cannot go about the business of protecting our life support system with less than half of the population involved. Duh.
Thank you, Audrey. As we wrap up, one last question for our panelists. Kiki, you wanted to add something. I'll allow you to go ahead.
I would also add to that seed power and seed resources.
Yep.
A lot of times people who are in power go, I want to help, but they want to hold the reins. And so our system is inequitable. Our system systematically remove power and resources from people of color, give it back, and let them decide what is best for them. And once you've given it over, if you've truly given it over, you can say to them, here's the power, here are the resources. Is there a place for me? I would like to help support this if I can. What is the place for me? And that's it. No strings attached, no control. That's what you can do.
Thank you so much, Kiki. I just cannot emphasize that enough, and Audrey's point as well.
Mm-hmm.
As we wrap up this panel this evening, for those who would like to learn more, reflect, share resources with their institutions and their own communities, is there a publication of any sort that you would like to recommend? And please just say why that you are recommending that specific publication.
Leo, I want to, recommend to folks, if they have not had a chance to read, it's The Myth of Wild Africa. And it's by Jonathan Adams and Thomas McShane, right? It's the conservation without illusion. And I found this fascinating, even before when I addressed that. It was done in, it's 1992, I think, or 1994. But these were folks who actually worked in the field. But a lot of it is talking about Africa conservation and the perception that folks have of Africa as an Eden. We don't have qualified people on the continent that can do conservation. It's absolutely erroneous. We know that. It talks about the issues with the displacement and the Maasai and their land, and the sort of the local connection that people have with the land, and the importance of indigenous people and local communities. And I could never forget, having a conversation with a colleague who was doing some work in an African country, and he, and I said to him, and it was a white colleague, and I said, we need to transition. You're going out there, that's great, and you're going to be seconded out there for a couple of years, but you're going to be there after 2 years, and you're going to have to transition to local leadership, because that's what we want to do. And after 2 years, I said, let's start talking about coming back. That person said, I could not find a local in that country to do the job. And that just turned my stomach, right? And it was really one of those things where, there is talent, in the countries where international conservation is taking place, whether it's to combat climate change, whether it's to protect water, whether it's to address pollution. I don't care what your issue is. There is talent, and there is indigenous people, and there's local knowledge there. And the idea that, and I always used to get a little bit hung up on the idea of stakeholders, and I remember, an African brother saying to me, Kelvin, hey, we are not stakeholders, we are shareholders. So even me, when we talk about engaging, local community, they're not stakeholders, they're shareholders. I mean, that's their place, that's their land. They have lived on it, they know what's best, and they have the solution. So no matter what the issue is, I would say that we look at, when we engage on international conservation issues and we engage in countries, we really pay attention to that, because that's critical for me in terms of success. I don't see how we get to a major goal of protecting the planet and securing space for the future generation without us taking a sort of a non-racial approach or to the issue of conservation. So I would just say, hey, myth of wild Africa, put that on your.
And Kelvin, to add to your very important point, I would also suggest for anybody who is in senior position in a conservation organization and you think that you cannot identify a local to take up key positions, train them.
Yeah.
Find those pathways that individuals can be educated and trained in these amazing global institutions and get them into those positions. Kelvin, we know that the best forestry departments in the Caribbean are run by people who left, got their degrees abroad, and came back and are building the conservation national park programs of the Lesser Antilles and beyond. We don't have time to get into that right now, but I'll pass the baton to Audrey and Kiki in terms of your publication that you would like to recommend. You can go first, Audrey.
Oh, great, thank you. And I have to second what Kelvin said, we're all shareholders, nobody came and nobody was born with a back pocket full of money, we all came here naked and afraid, and so everything that's here belongs to all of us, and all of us have the responsibility to help care for it. And the publication I would recommend, I'm sorry, it's a little self-serving, but it's my second book, Our True Nature, Finding a Zest for Life in the National Park System. And I recommend that because in it, I talk about my favorite of the 185 units of the National Park System that I've been to. And I tell people when to go, what the related history is to people of color, where to stay, what to do, what to see, etc. So it's a very easy primer, if you want, to people who are going into the outdoors and who are looking to make a business of taking other people into the outdoors, because it just gives you an easy grounding.
Thank you, Audrey.
For me, I thought about this question because we had it in advance, and I kept coming back to the book that helped me to get to where I am, and it actually has nothing to do with the environment. It's Maya Angelou's, actually her whole series of autobiographies. And those books liberated me and gave me a pathway to create a path for myself, because there is no path for someone who looks like me in this field. And what I saw with Maya Angelou, and I keep that mentality with me, is that she pursued her heart's desire. And when there wasn't a way, she made a way. She was, even with the slimmest of resources, even in the face of huge risk and uncertainty, even with having suffered things that would put people in therapy for years, she used it as rocket fuel to always move forward. And when you look at her life, she did greatness. I mean, we know her as a poet, but she danced with Alvin Ailey, sang opposite of Della Reese, worked for Martin Luther King, worked for Malcolm X, all those things before we knew who she was, because of that approach. And so for me, I would say this book recommendation is for someone who wants to do this work and saying, hey, I don't see a model for myself. Maya Angelou is my model. And her tenacity and her way of approaching every aspect of her life. And so I recommend that.
Thank you so much, Kiki. And thank you to this incredible panel this evening. I was just scrolling through the Q&A, and how many people are framing this discussion that we have just had in terms of your sincerity, in terms of you making yourselves vulnerable publicly and discussing these issues. and also framing this within the context of therapy, mentoring, and support for themselves as people of color. So again, thank you to everybody. Again, I would just like in closing to thank the entire NYU community, the NYU Office of Global Inclusion, the NYU Office of Sustainability, the Department of Environmental Studies and Animal Studies, our liberal studies faculty who are always there with me, including and most importantly, the members of the Sustainable Health and the Environment Concentration that has organized this event. And again, special thanks to our Dean, Julie Mostoff, who has been an advocate of these issues of inclusion and centering the voices of BIPOC people on campus and beyond. Thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you all again in this space very, very soon.
Thank you, Leo.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, my panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, love you all.